which is a resolution proclaiming the month of September 2023 as Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders Awareness Month in San Luis Obispo County. And Supervisor Arnold is going to do the honors of reading this resolution.
Yes. So the resolution has been introduced, and it reads as follows. Whereas fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, and abbreviated as FASDs, awareness is celebrated around the world in September, reminding us that as many as 180,000 babies, as high as 5% of children overall, are born with FASDs because they were exposed to alcohol prenatally, making FASDs the leading preventable cause of birth defects and neurodevelopment disorders in the United States. And whereas, although children with fetal alcohol syndrome, FASD, who make up 10% of the FASD children, can often be identified through physical characteristics at birth, most children with FASDs, 90% of them, have no visible physical abnormalities. And because diagnosis requires confirmation of prenatal alcohol exposure and a neurodevelopmental analysis, a large proportion, as high as 80%, are undiagnosed or misdiagnosed with other conditions such as ADD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, bipolar disorder, autism spectrum, and/or conduct disorder. Whereas there are more than 2 million Californians affected by FASDs, many of whom remain underidentified and underserved, including in some of the most marginalized demographics: foster youth, incarcerated adults, chronically unemployed adults, and chronically unhoused people. And whereas with correct identification and understanding and intervention, people with FASDs can and will go on to lead healthy, productive lives. Whereas without appropriate identification and support, disproportionate numbers of people with FASDs enter the juvenile dependency and justice systems and go on to the adult criminal justice system, are confined in correctional institutions and become unemployed, unhoused, all of which impose tremendous societal costs. Whereas the need for greater attention to the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder in California it's well documented in contrast with states that are leaders in the U.S. in addressing FASDs: Alaska, Michigan, Minnesota, and Washington, all of which have created a state staff position or body to develop interagency coordination to address FASDs in coordinated, comprehensive manner required. Whereas the County of San Luis Obispo has a long history of attention to FASDs, including its participation in the Universal Screening Program and the health agency's support of Martha's Place Children's Center, and whereas the County of San Luis Obispo has formed a group comprised of doctors, parents, nonprofit groups, educators, agency representatives, known as the FASD San Luis Obispo Leadership Team, it's committed to spending team that's committed to spending awareness of this silent public health epidemic. Now, therefore, be it resolved and ordered by the Board of Supervisors, County of San Luis Obispo, State of California, as follows. Number 1, September 2023 is hereby proclaimed Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders Awareness Month in San Luis Obispo County. And number 2, all citizens are encouraged to educate themselves and others about the dangers of fetal alcohol exposure, as well as the needs and potential of the children and adults affected by it. And number 3, the health agency shall explore strengthening and coordinating services and detection efforts for children who may have fetal alcohol exposures and report back in 180 days with a progress report regarding its efforts.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Charles Crandall, and I served for 19 years on the bench in San Luis Obispo until retiring 1 year ago. It was during my term as the presiding juvenile court judge, that was from 2017 to 2021, that I came to understand both the devastation and the magnitude of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, which we refer to as FASD, and how much more we need to do in the way of both diagnostic capacity and therapeutic resources. Although the state and county numbers of kids with FASDs are very high in dependency court, where I served, estimates as high as 50%, and in juvenile justice court, where I also served, as high as 60%. During my time there, I saw no kids, 0 kids, and that's a 3.5-year stint, who carried the diagnosis. And that deficiency was what motivated me to get involved. As a side note, my brother-in-law was one of the founding doctors of fetal alcohol syndrome back in the 1970s. And it was a discussion with him one night when I was talking about how the removals of kids was so traumatic, and some of them were suffering from heroin addiction, some of them from methamphetamine addiction right in the womb and while born. And he looked at me straight in the eye and said, "Alcohol's much worse." To which I said, "Get out of here," okay? And that led to this journey that I'm talking to you about. We call it a hidden disability, all right? And that's something to keep in mind. If we go to slide 2, we can sort of skip over the introductory slide if we're able to do the slides, and otherwise I'll keep on moving. Yeah, there is a PowerPoint, but don't worry, I'll keep going while we talk. So the reason I call it a hidden disability is for this: the prevalence is amazing. If I asked you, so how many kids do you think in a classroom or in a school would suffer from fetal alcohol spectrum disorder? You probably would say, well, maybe 1 in 1,000, 1 in 250. The numbers are as high as 1 in 20, okay? So in every single classroom in San Luis Obispo and throughout the United States, you may have a child who's suffering from FASD and not know it. Why? Okay, why, you ask? Well, you probably, as I did before I was educated, thought, well, with fetal alcohol syndrome, it's recognizable. Their facial features, a doctor can look at those facial features, and by the way, Dr. Abdul Qadir does a fabulous job at this and can pick up the kids who may have those features. That's less than 10% of the people, the kids who carry the diagnosis. And the other 90% of what I'm going to focus on have no facial features, and they present, as I'll say later, normally. If you looked at a kid at birth, you would look at the kid and say, oh, that's a wonderful kid. And in fact, some of our most fierce advocates in our group are adoptive mothers who had no idea that they were about to adopt a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And the challenges that that diagnosis poses, as I'll talk about in a minute, are extraordinary. So the elephant in the room, so it's FASDs, right? Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders, of which FAS is one component. But there is one called, and this is, I say, the elephant in the room, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. That requires 2 things for a diagnosis. First, it's a clinical diagnosis. So number 1, you have to have a confirmation of prenatal alcohol use. And you can imagine sometimes that's not easy to find out because of the blame and shame with mothers who may have been drinking while they're pregnant. The last thing they want to do is say, oh yes, I drank while I was pregnant. So that's number 1. Number 2 is a neurodevelopmental analysis, meaning that a psychologist with training goes in and does an analysis of the child to figure out what are the milestones that that child is meeting or not meeting. And the gap is usually very, very wide. And as I'll talk about in a minute, the problems that pose for the parent, the child, the school system, the juvenile justice system in the world are extraordinary. The slide 2, if we're able to back up to there. So the study that talks about prevalence, where I said it's high as 1 in every classroom, is a 2018 study in the Journal of American Medical Association. So it's a peer-reviewed study, and I'll supply it to staff. They probably know about this anyway, but that's the prevalence. So it's much higher than we would say. Now, if we go on to slide 3, yeah, so this is collected. So when San Luis Obispo is a leader in the sense that we got involved with the 4Ps plus assessment tool years ago. And if you look at that graph, what's amazing about it is, although, you know, there are warning labels and there are things about alcohol use that say you shouldn't drink while you're pregnant, look how over time the alcohol use documented by pregnant women is going up. and up and up. And we don't have the COVID data, but I would bet that it's up a lot higher than 50%. That's some alcohol use during pregnancy. And you say, well, that's not so bad, right? I mean, it's not bad because a little alcohol doesn't matter. Okay, the answer to that is wrong. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. So here's what the medical community says is risky drinking. It can be, and think about, and I'm going to just take the middle class, upper class woman who goes to work, comes home at night and has a drink, just one glass of wine, and does that for 2 weeks during pregnancy, any 2 weeks. That's risky drinking, okay? That puts her right in the danger zone of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Or on the second level, you have 3 drinks per occasion on 2 occasions during pregnancy. We would call that binge drinking. That's not that much binge drinking, right? It's 3 drinks 2 times during the 9-month period. Now you're in risky business as well. So one of the reasons there's such a high prevalence is because there's lots of risky drinking going on, and we're winding up with these FASD births. As Dr. Abdul Qadir is fond of saying, and I am too, there is no safe level of drinking alcohol when pregnant. But guess what? Most women don't know they're pregnant until the 2nd trimester. So you could do all the damage during the 1st trimester when you don't even know it. When I get to my last point, I want to talk about permanent significant brain damage. That's one thing. And then I also want to talk about, and this is not my phrase, a presenter that I saw presented it. It's brain, not blame, okay? You have to understand how alcohol typically affects the unborn fetus and how it affects the children who are born with the diagnosis. If we go on to the next slide. So these are, I'm going to talk about the 6-year-old, the 10-year-old, and the 18-year-old. But what happens is that alcohol affects many parts of the brain. Some parts of the brain it leaves alone. But if you look at the 6-year-old, right, that's a 6-year-old boy, let's say, the developmental age, meaning the age at which that kid processes things, is able to interact with his peers, et cetera, is that of a 3-year-old. And ditto with the comprehension age. In other words, an ability to assemble and make executive decisions that a 6-year-old might be able to do, that 6-year-old is hitting in the 3-year-old range. And you'll see as we go on to a 10-year-old, the gap widens. In other words, as kids age, the difference between their chronological age and their developmental age widens. So you have a 10-year-old with a developmental age of 5. You have an 18-year-old with a developmental age of 9. And it goes on as they go into adulthood. And if you think about that for a second, think of the trouble, and if our member, our mom, adoptive mom were here, she'd tell you about this. Think of the trouble that would happen when you get a 6-year-old with a development age of comprehension age of 3 out on the playground. Think of the 10-year-old with a development age of 5. Think of the 18-year-old with a development age of a 9-year-old. But the thing is, if you look at these kids, they don't obviously present as, oh, there's really something wrong with this kid, because they have strengths. So that 6-year-old may have the art and sports ability of a 10-year-old. Expressive language. Kids with FASD can talk a really good game. They can talk. So you think they're getting it when they're interacting with somebody, but they don't. And because their receptive language, the ability to understand what's being told to them, is a 2-year-old. All right? And it goes on and on. I'm not going to spend the time going through it, but you can imagine why they are considered troublemakers at school. You can imagine why they wind up in juvenile justice court when they reach that age, because they don't have the executive functioning to say, you shouldn't do that. An 18-year-old's got a 9-year-old's executive functioning. What do you think that kid is going to present with a problem? And what we know about these kids, if we do nothing, zero, we're going to wind up with a huge population, we already have it, of unhoused, chronically employed people who are receiving services maybe for some other diagnosis. In the resolution, we talked about ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, or conduct disorder. You know, that's we can't treat this kid. This kid's got, you know, he's just born with the bad gene. You wind up with a population that is incredibly expensive. On the other hand, the good news is there are therapies that are available that if we diagnose these kids properly and early and we get them the right therapy, they can live healthy and productive lives. And I'll just give you one example. Alcohol does not, for some reason we don't fully understand, affect long-term memory. So in schools, the teachers are being trained to teach to the long-term memory of these kids. If they know they have an FASD kid, then the way to teach is to their long-term memory and their techniques to do that, and they can do very well. But if you put them in school with the rest of the gang, they're going to do miserably poorly. So, and ultimately, you know, I was a judge. I was involved in public safety. I know it's a board priority. These kids also turn out to be some of the most cruel, if you will, for other words. They wind up on death row. They wind up, in fact, most recently, Nicholas Cruz, who murdered 17 high school students in Parkland, Florida. Guess what? Pending trial, he was finally diagnosed with FASD. But that's not what we want to happen, okay? And we need to properly diagnose these kids while they're young and get them in special education services. And we also need to get the word out there that this is a much bigger problem than previously known. So I think it fits into your priorities, public safety priorities, mental health priorities, homelessness priorities. You know, this is all in the right direction. Two things in conclusion. I know that the health agency, so our group has a great agency with a great relationship with the health agency. And I don't think they want to be, when I was speaking to them, they said, well, that bit in the proclamation about ordering the health agency to report back, they said, well, we're presenting the resolution. We don't want to report back to ourselves. I would like something like that. Because we need to start doing something, not just listening to it. And so, you know, I would invite, for example, one of you to join our group. I promise it will not be onerous. There are no dues. You can attend remotely. But that will bring, I am convinced, if one of you joins our group, we will get lots of participation by the agencies who right now are kind of at the periphery and thinking, well, maybe it's not my problem. And that's what's been going on in California. The agencies who are out there say, hey, it's not my problem. So I really appreciate you giving me more time than allotted. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know we've got some pups behind that need to get out of here. So with that, I will conclude my remarks, but thank you very much for giving me the time.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Board comments?
Is there any additional public comment?
I just,
So seeing none, I'll bring it back to the board now for additional board comments.
Thank you.
Supervisor Ortiz-Lane.
thank you. I got so excited. I was jumping there. Judge Crandall, thank you so much for taking the time, taking your time, what you do for our children, whether it's at CASA, but also bringing this awareness forward. I think it's, I had no idea. And, you know, working so much with the unhoused, I can see what you're saying in regards to the misdiagnosis that is occurring out there and the critical nature of increasing the awareness of this. So we'll talk. Thank you.
Supervisor Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Judge, for being here. I appreciate the resolution raising awareness. It turns out this county has a long, strong, and very proud history of dealing with FASD through Martha's Place, which has passing mention in the resolution. It is a program that is housed now in our health agency that was inspired and started by my predecessor, the late Supervisor Bianchi, who had a grandchild who suffered from FASD. And the public should know that that dedicated group of folks headed by, medically, by Dr. Nisha Abdul-Qadir, who you referenced, has long been an extraordinary resource for the diagnosis and therapy for FASD in children. And we have to thank our first 5 commission who seeded that, and subsequent boards of supervisors who have supported the operation of Martha's Place through tough budget times and better ones. Martha's Place has always been challenged to expand the word, expand its ability to treat this. And as you note, sir, there are many, many individuals, now adults, who suffer from this, and as a consequence, many others suffer. So again, I think the resolution today is extremely important in bringing this awareness forward. It is a problem that we need to continue to work on, because as it turns out, early diagnosis of FASD, we're talking in the 1, 2, maybe 3 years old, can make a tremendous difference in the outcome for those children. So pleased to have you here today. My hat's off to those within our health agency and our nonprofit friends who work in this space, and appreciate the opportunity to hear about it.
Thank you, Supervisor Arnold.
Yeah, Judge Crandall, I want to thank you as well, and I think there are many people that were not as aware that FASD goes so undiagnosed, and that we need to pay more attention to it and use our public health resources on prevention, I think is what we're hearing from you, that we can work a little harder together to try to solve some of the problems behind this. So thank you for being here.
Supervisor Paulding?
Thank you, Judge, for your advocacy, for educating the public and our board, and I look forward to continuing to work with our health agency to do more in this area. Thank you.
And I'll thank you too, Judge. You do a difficult job and under really difficult circumstances, so thank you for shedding some light on this.
You're welcome. I'm retired. It's not that bad.
Thank you.